We're here today on the 224th anniversary of what was to be known as the Traitors' Execution on Plymouth Hoe, or on Love's Hill as it was known in its day. We're just going to give you a brief update today of some of the new information we found out relating to this infamous date in Plymouth's history, which is surrounded by many myths and inaccuracies which were basically stemmed from the reports of the day. From the last 2 years, information that myself, Terry Wilson and various others have dug up to further enhance the truth behind this story. We've uncovered not only more about the 3 men who met their fate on this very spot or in this vicinity on that day, but more interestingly we found out the story of John McGuinness, who was whipped just beforehand for his part in the attempted mutiny. John McGuinness was brought out first about 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning that day through the sally port of the Citadel and led up to this rough area of where the War Memorial is today, and was tied up with both arms so that he could be flogged. He was sentenced to 1,000 lashes of the whip, but upon appeal to the King was reduced to 500. On that day there would have been a huge crowd here, estimates of between 10 and 40,000 members of the public, as well as the many different militias, volunteers and regiments, including cavalry and Plymouth militia. Once tied up, the whippings began. John McGuinness was 64 years old. He was an elderly man, of that day was considered quite old, and yet he managed to hold out for 416 lashes of the whip before he was no longer conscious or could be brought back to consciousness, and therefore was taken down on a cart, or a sedan as they called it, and taken away for treatment. Just after he had left, the 3 men, Robert Lee, Joseph Brannan and Daniel Coffey, were led from the same exit of the Citadel up to this rough spot where they were knelt at prayer, read their last rites, and obviously the warrant of execution would have been read, and then they were put to death. We've covered that in great detail, and more detail will come out soon, but today I want to focus more about the story of John McGuinness. John McGuinness was taken away and no more was heard of him. We knew that he was sent to Australia, or New South Wales as it was known, and he was to receive the rest of his punishment upon recovery. We know that he did recover and that he must have received this further 90 or so lashes, because in 1798 he is put aboard what was known as the Hillsborough. This was the 3rd voyage of convicts to be sent to New South Wales, which was a new penal colony set up after America had won independence. The Hillsborough, like its namesake, was a tragedy. It was the worst affected ship on any travelling to New South Wales, and it lost 96 souls on the journey to New South Wales, a long and arduous journey of suffering and pain and misery. John McGuinness was aboard this ship. He was 65 years old at this age, recovering with a deeply scarred and wounded back, and he went along this very hard journey, rout with fever and disease, scurvy, dysentery. They passed around the Cape of South Africa, where they needed to take on provisions and rest for a while because of the fevers, and then they headed on to New South Wales, a journey of some 3 months at sea. Upon arriving at New South Wales, John McGuinness was supposed to have been enlisted into the local regiment of militia to serve as a protectorate of the new colony. But upon arrival, he's never enlisted. This stumped us for a couple of years, but then we found out the reason why. He was never allowed to join because of his age and ill health. So instead, he was sentenced, the sentence was changed to a life of hard labour. He then would work the land, agriculture, helping set up the farms and the colony, which had struggled for many years to establish a foothold because they couldn't grow crops and they suffered very, very harshly. The conditions were hot, as you can expect, around the Sydney area where they landed, of Botany Bay. And eventually, through his years of service there, he ended up in a place called Parramatta, where he worked the land. A small town was established, and we know that he lived within this very small town. We have plans of the town, and we know its rough layout. But he became friends with another convicted man who gained his freedom and would later set up the first media or newspaper for Australia and become a famous founding father for what would become Australia. John was a very good friend of his. We know this because upon his death, or before his death, he petitioned for his freedom, a pardon, which he was granted. And his friend, I can't remember the name, I do have it wrote down, but he actually helped him write the petition and was his proposer for freedom. John's signature is on this declaration, and we can actually see it. He's quite articulate, nice handwriting, and he was granted his freedom. He didn't spend long then, he only had several more years of life before he passed away in Parramatta, New South Wales. This area in New South Wales has the oldest surviving graveyard in Australia. It's still there today, a small section of land, a small parcel of land, and it has the oldest headstones from this period in history, from the 1700s. Sadly, John did not have a headstone, so we do not know the exact spot of his burial. Although what we do know is that he is still buried there in unmarked ground. The church itself is looking through the records to try and find a bit more about John and whether anything else could be added to the story. But what we do know is that this elderly man who was wrapped up in this conspiracy of mutiny and sedition, which was blown out of massive proportion, which hit the national media, was brought onto the Hoe, flogged brutally, then transported through the most horrific of journeys to one of the harshest environments in the known world at the time, survived all of these to a very elderly age of about 84 years, and then was buried. It's a sort of harsh tale, but it's kind of nice to know that this man got through so much hardship and yet, you know, had a long life.